Started here. Okay. We are going to continue with, as I mentioned today in my message, we're going to continue with a little bit more, a couple more people just before we get to Ben Gurion. And then we'll start with David Ben Gurion tonight. And my guess is we're going to have at least tonight and one more class on him. Originally, I was going to do kind of a surface thing. I decided, no, I need to do a little bit more depth. Once we finish with David Ben Gurion, we're going to go back and take a macro look at all that's been going on, because we talked about lots of people in those last couple of months. And then we kind of have to back up like we've done in other time periods after you learn about the personalities and look at the overall picture, kind of a bird's eye view of what is it that they were, not what they accomplished, these individuals, but what was tachlis, what actually came of it. Well, we know that what came of Ben Gurion was we ended up with the state, and it happened because of many people who came before him, as we've talked about already. But you already know the ending of, well, this part of the story, which is great. So let's get started. So we left off last time talking about Chaim Weizmann, who again was going from one capital in Europe to another. He had the prestige, he had the honor, he had the name recognition, and he was really doing a lot for the Yeshuva Yashan. We usually refer to Yeshuva Yashan, the pre-state Israel, even before that. And we're talking, but at that point, while he's doing this, there's a different type of Zionism that is starting to take root in what is called then Palestine. It was called labor Zionism. The dominant force in the Yishuv through the early part of the 20th century, which was still called the Yishuv because until 1948, the socialist ideals become infused into the project of what will become eventually the land of Israel. People believed, those who were socialists believed that the transformation of the social structure of the Jews, they were dispersed. We talked about this when we talked about at least two or three other people or personalities, the dispersion of the Jews into a trading class, peddlers and shoemakers and of that nature, into progressive, productive, egalitarian working people to move up the ladder. This is the idea of what we're going to talk about. Two people, Nachman Sirkin and Ber Baruchov. They are responsible for, let's say, laying the foundations of socialism. And with the word nowadays, we're going to see a couple of the quotes of what socialism and Marxist socialism is. You'll be able to just say, see Mamdani, unfortunately, of the city of New York. In any case, Sirkin was one of the first, most original thinkers when it came to the idea of fusing Zionism and socialism. Right now, we're just going to use socialism as a general term, meaning equality among all the people. And he's pretty much the first one that fused those two. He's born in Belarus, at that time part of the Russian Empire. And when he's growing up, he's born in 1868. As he's growing up, he's coming of age in a world where Jews are politically marginalized, economically restricted, socially alienated. Again, these things, these are themes that repeat themselves for quite a long period of time. And he's deeply influenced by the fact that emancipation in Western Europe has pretty much been a failure by this point. So between the failure of the emancipation, which means failure as far as for the Jews was concerned, and the persistent anti-Semitism, it in his eyes was preventing the Jews from moving forward in Europe. He was educated in Germany and was drawn to the concept of socialism, but he recognized that a class-based socialism would not solve the Jewish problem. Jews were not only an exploited class, they were also dispersed people. They were cut off from productive labor, they were cut off from land ownership, political sovereignty. Again, this I know I'm repeating myself, but I'm not repeating myself about this individual. I'm talking about the same time period, because you talk about so many people who've intersected already with this time period. And he felt that without national restoration, i.e., having our own country, that socialism would not be an effective tool for the Jewish people. In other words, to try to invent a socialist type of an environment for Jews in Europe was not going to happen. He also argued, as did Baruchov, which we'll see about him in a couple minutes, of what he called economic distortion or the upside down pyramid, the overrepresentation of Jews in commerce and underrepresentation in agriculture and industry. And he felt it was a direct result of the exile, meaning living in Galut, in the diaspora, and that only a return to the land of Israel would right that pyramid and would make a bigger base for the Jews, both in agriculture, industry, and so many other areas. Themes that we've seen already from a couple other people, such as Pinsker. And he felt that it only would happen with a return to the land of Israel. And that would happen with collective labor and social equality. Now, the word collective labor may sound a little familiar because these are the early, we're going to see shortly, the early thoughts that will give birth to the concept of kibbutz, which we'll talk about. His vision was not religious, not at all, not in the traditional sense at least, but it was profoundly moral. He felt that a society built on justice, shared responsibility, and dignity through labor would in fact bring the people together, make them cohesive, give us our land that we could live in a not utopian society because he wasn't an idiot, but at least in a better society for the Jew, much more so than being in Europe. At the first Zionist Congress that Herzl had called in 1897, Sirkin stood out as one of the few delegates who identified himself explicitly as social Zionist. He later helped founds the movement called Poalei Tzion, not to be confused with Poal HaMizrahi, the very different world. Poalei Tzion, the workers of Zion. And he also influenced a lot of the groundwork, which again, eventually becomes the beginning of kibbutz movement in the land of Israel, before Israel, well, still pre-state Israel. The tone of his world was universal. But at the same time, notice he had a broad picture of what he felt about not just the Jews, but people in general. But his focus was on the national structure of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And he felt they would only redeem themselves. I'm not using that term in a religious sense, but in a getting themselves out of the mire and muck that they've been in for so long in Europe. They would not redeem themselves with power or privilege, but rather by building a society through work, that they had to put the elbow grease into it. A similar individual was born just a few years after him, Ber Baruchov, who dies very young. Had a little bit more of a different perspective. They live at the same time, the difference in ages, but he's no less influential in bringing a systematic and theoretical approach to labor Zionism. He's born in Ukraine. And he originally insisted that Jews were an actual nation under a Marxist analysis. They were a distorted class structure. It was caused by displacement, by exile. In other words, he saw the Jews already living in a certain rubric or a certain form that he felt was not going to survive where it was, and it needed to be transported to the land of Israel, because where they were staying, they would be perpetually vulnerable to anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, almost every one of the people we have dealt with in the last few months we've talked about Zionism, one of the underlying currents keeps coming back to the topic of anti-Semitism, whether it's because of pogroms or laws that prevent the Jews from having certain jobs, getting involved in commerce, getting involved in politics, whatever it might be. This is always in the back of the mind of all the founding fathers, so to speak, of Zionism. He also is one of the co-founders of Poalei Tzion, the Workers of Zion. And he wants to synthesize Marxism, Zionism, and Hebrew culture. He dies at a young age of 36 years old, but he still was extremely influential to such an extent. He was one of the big influences on David Ben Gurion and Beryl Katzenelson, who we're not going to talk about not for a while, and some other labor Zionist leaders. Even when they went against what they saw as too rigid of stats, when it would be a Marxist approach. His remains were brought to burial, reinterred in Israel. I don't know the year. I forgot to look. They were reinterred in Israel. He did not live, of course, to see the birth of the state. But his ideology came to fruition already in the second Aliyah. The second Aliyah, we haven't really discussed early on when I gave a general overview. I was talking about the first Aliyah, the second Aliyah, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh. But the second Aliyah was the 10 years, about a decade, from about 1904 to 1914. In that wave of Aliyah, a generation of young immigrants from Russia established the first kibbutzim, and it becomes the birth of what becomes known as the Histadrut, which till this very day is an extremely powerful, let me call it an organization for now. We're going to talk a little bit about what it was in a few minutes, and because of Ben Gurion's involvement. In English, it's called the General Federation of Jewish Labor, and it comes into existence in 1920. I will just give you a sense of how wide the tentacles of the Histadrut go, that when the Histadrut in the past had called for a wildcat strike here in Israel, it shuts the country down. It's almost, I can't say almost every labor force in the country somehow is connected to Histadrut. So when they call for a wildcat strike, it definitely paralyzes the country. For those of you who are familiar with American history, the AFL-CIO, American Federation of Labor, I forgot CIO stands for, is also had a similar power, probably still does, I don't know, in being able, when they would go on strike, especially the truckers, one of the big divisions of the AFL-CIO, would paralyze the country. You think, big deal about truckers. Well, truckers are the ones who are bringing merchandise back and forth from factory to various locations for distribution, from distribution to point of purchase. So it brings a halt to commerce. And again, these two people who are heavily influenced by the ideas of Sirkin and Barakhov are David Ben Gurion and Beryl Katzenelson. They both they're both born at the same time. Ben Gurion and Katzenelson are both born in 1886 and 1887. Again, they're contemporaries as young people of the two formerly mentioned individuals. Ben Gurion lives until 1973. Katzenelson dies in 1944, before the birth of the state. All these people that I'm mentioning tonight, Sirkin, Barakhov, Ben Gurion, Katzenelson, like I say, we're not going to talk about him too much, are all intertwined and are starting to build the structure for what will become we'll call, some countries call us the Zionist entity. I won't use those words, but the Zionist project. Zionism is not a dirty word. It's a fantastic word. And as we've been learning and talking about for quite a while, it is been distorted in modern times, in the last, especially since the beginning of the war here in October, a couple of years ago. And in order to understand where we're going, we have to understand our past as well. So what I want to do is I want to begin discussing David Ben Gurion. And I'm going to mention toch kedei as I'm going through this concept of Marxist philosophy. Socialism in general, people understand a little bit, kind of equality, and like we have, where Israel is more or less to a degree a socialist country, not just the kibbutzim, but also the health funds, the concept of certain things that are available equally to everybody after a certain age, whatever it might be. But I'm not going to talk about modern Jewish history at the moment. Let's just stay focused on the mid 1800s and on. So David Ben Gurion is probably, and I'm really going out on a limb here, is probably one of the most consequential figures in Jewish history after the destruction of, let's say, since the time of the Talmud. One of the most consequential figures in Jewish history. There are people who have made massive changes for us. There are people who have made massive changes in the world. People who've had been vectors, which we've talked about in history, that something happens at a point where things vector this way instead of going that way. We talked about this, but David Ben Gurion, who was a very short of stature individual, was actually a giant. Not without controversy, not without lots of stuff. We're going to talk about him. His life's work, which was to transform the Zionist dream into an actual reality, which meant a sovereign state of Israel, would bring to fruition a dream that had been hovering above the Jewish people for almost 2,000 years. We tend to forget because we are, I don't want to say complacent, but we don't know how to think about these kind of things. After the destruction of Beit HaMikdash, this is the time when we started this class, was after that time period, at that point. And we talked about there was a last gasp in approximately year 130 of the Common Era with the Bar Kokhba revolt. But after the destruction of Beit HaMikdash, until 1948, Jews were ruled in this country. Were not ruling the country. Either it was under the Turks, or it was under the British, or it was under the Romans, or it was whoever it might have been under. But we didn't have run of the mill, run of the roost, so to speak. It wasn't ours. So even though we had a shadow government to a degree, which we'll see, which actually was through the Histadrut as it grows, we didn't have abilities to pass laws. We didn't have ability to enforce laws. We didn't have, not at all. And it was because of David Ben-Gurion and those people who came before him and influenced him, whether it's people like Menachem Begin and we could go on forever with just this time period, which we won't. But at the same time, Ben-Gurion was a paradoxical individual. He was a secular Jew who saw himself continuing a biblical narrative on the one hand. He also saw himself pragmatic. He was a politician, but he had some messianic visions. What I mean by messianic visions is not what we're talking Mashiachistim today. We're not talking about man's going to ride in a white donkey, which you see plenty of those in the body, ride in a white donkey and all of a sudden the Mashiach. But it meant like a massive change of Jewish history, of having our own country. But at the same time, even though he knew Tanakh very well, and he knew Halakha very well. Nevertheless, he was a man who broke with traditional Judaism to the point where he purposefully ate chazer and other things. So he did not carry on the traditions of the Jewish people in the traditional sense. I have a book here somewhere. I don't remember exactly where, and it has questions that people ask about Israel. And one of the first questions, it's a common question, is that they kind of want to denigrate Israel as a country, as a Medinat Israel, as it was founded by a bunch of Amaratzim, a bunch of boors. It was founded by people who were anti-religious, people who weren't religious, people who had no respect for religion, such as David Ben-Gurion, and on and on and on and on. And how can you respect this, and what kind of country could that be? So I heard an amazing parable, and I really, really liked it. Imagine a person is driving in a car, and the car overturns in a ditch. And as it happens, someone drives up, pulls over, and helps the guy, saves his life, pulls this man out of the wreckage, saves his life. The car explodes 2 seconds later, like in the movies, and they're looking at it, fade to black. Of course, he's extremely thankful to this man, and the one who was in the car wreck decides to have a Seudat Hoda'ah. And he has a Seudat Hoda'ah, meal of Thanksgiving, and he invites his family. And at the time, he's a young married man, doesn't have any kids yet, and he makes a decision that every year on the anniversary of that, he will make a Seudat Hoda'ah and thank Hashem. And he, over time, has kids, and the kids come, and over time, the kids get older, and it becomes clear, and every year the man who saved his life is at the Seudah. Man was not religious. Wasn't really who saved him. And as it gets older and older, the kids start questioning, Abba, I don't understand. Why are we celebrating Seudat Hoda'ah with this man? He's not religious. Yeah. So, but he's not religious. Yeah, but he saved my life. Without me, you wouldn't exist. I mean, without him, you wouldn't exist. I would have been killed in that car accident. The car blew up. In a similar fashion, the book does not use that mashal, the parable. I heard it from somebody once in Chicago. In a similar fashion, even though the state of Israel came into being largely through the non-religious. So what? So what? If that's the way the Yad Hashem was working, that's the way Yad Hashem is working. We have to understand that Israel did not happen, just pop up by itself one day as a result of the pogroms. Okay, all of a sudden people like Herzl and this one and that one and this Congress and that meeting and this Chovevei Tzion and this Aliyah, boom, we have this country. No, the Yad Hashem was very obvious throughout, as it is right now, today, literally right now. Trump just announced, just before I came out of class, he said something to the Iranian people, hang in there, we're coming to help you. Something to that effect. Have your mamad clear, I guess. In any case, you can't deny the fact that Yad Hashem, the hand of God, was involved in every step. So the fact that it happened through someone not religious, it should make no. Would we want to have had more religious aspect to the birth of the country? It's a debate you can have on your own. It's not for tonight. But so we need to talk about who in the heck was David Ben Gurion. Well, first of all, he wasn't David Ben Gurion his whole life. He was born David Yosef Grun in the city of Plunsk, in a small town in Russia. It was controlled by Poland at the time. I didn't understand this when I was a kid, but you'd ask someone who's older, like, what country your parents from, or were they from? Well, depends they were born when it was Ukraine, then it was Russia, then it was Poland, whatever. So yeah, you'd understand because the borders shifted. Tell someone today that said their grandparents were born in Czechoslovakia. It doesn't exist anymore. I know it's the Czech Republic. And it took me years to stop saying the Ukraine. Years. Now it's normal to say Ukraine, but it was the Ukraine for years. In any case, when he comes into the world, he's coming into a world where Jewish life had external persecution and also a lot of internal tradition. So a lot of these competing forces. The Jews are getting persecuted for who they were. The Jews wanted to keep who they were. And yes, again, it's like I hear Anatevka in my head playing sometimes when we talk about these people. His father, Avigdor Grun, was a passionate Zionist, and he was a member already of the Chovevei Tzion movement, the name of that we've already mentioned that came into existence in the early 1800s. It was one of the early, what we call proto-Zionist organizations, the pre-Zionist actual state organizations. It came into existence as a response. It wasn't early, sorry, it was later in the 1800s, in response to pogroms. In the Gruen household, it was very common to talk about Zionism. It was very common to talk about aspirations for a homeland, which was not that common yet in many of the households in Poland /Russia /Ukraine /whatever. It was in their home, Zionism was not seen as heresy, it was seen as hope. It was a completely different perspective. And this is what David Ben Gurion is absorbing into himself. Why does he change his name to David Ben Gurion? He's known in English as David Green, who became David Ben Gurion. We'll see in a minute where he gets his name from. It wasn't just bringing a Hebrew name to his family. He spoke Hebrew and English, alongside Yiddish. Yiddish, of course, is the house language, but he also was learning Hebrew, thanks to, again, at some point with Eliezer Ben Yehuda. And he understood, very much like Eliezer Ben Yehuda, that the need for Hebrew was important to bring that back, although it was not his life's mission like was Ben Yehuda's. And in his home, the dream was a return to the Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel, not as messianic fantasy, but as practical and political need and necessity for where the Jews were holding in the real world. He received a traditional Jewish education. He did learn in Cheder. He learned Torah, he learned Talmud, he learned classical texts. He was not raised anti-religious. He was not raised as a boor with not knowing. He grew up knowing plenty. But even as a child, he was drawn to the secular Zionist youth movement at the time. One of the big ones at the time in Europe, in Eastern Europe, that he joined at age 14 was a youth group called Ezra, which is funny because nowadays it's one of the religious youth movements, similar to B'nai, well, similar, but in the same vein as B'nai Akiva and others. At that point, already at 14 years old, now back up before I say that sentence, I've mentioned many times when we've talked about so many different personalities in the last few months Zionism time and before Zionism times that he was raised, he was the like genius in Talmud, and he was the top student and all that. He wasn't. What he was already at 14, he was already becoming an organizer and a person who would have leadership qualities, which would eventually define his career. You will find that people who become amazing leaders and organizers, it almost always, I can't say always, there's no such thing, but almost always you could trace it back to something in their childhood, teen years, 20s at the latest, where they've already demonstrated certain aspects of it. Comes from two things: either the way their worldview at a young age, what they were influenced by, or they wanted to see a change. They didn't want this, they wanted a different way. Very much like someone who may grow up in a household where this value is very important. They hated that. They want to go to the other extreme, whatever it might be. But the tension between the religious tradition, which is, again, he's raised with that, he's learning it, and the secular nationalism would actually characterize his entire relationship with Judaism and the land of Israel as he starts to move forward towards headlong into this whole Zionist project. In 1906, he's 20 years old, and David Gurion makes a decision that will define the rest of his life. He decides to make Aliyah to what was at that time Ottoman Palestine. It was under the rule of Turkey, and it was not the Palestine of today. It wasn't even the Palestine of mandatory Palestine, which is the time period, the British, 1917 to 1948. That would come later. It was not that kind. What was it at that point? This is in 1906. It was characterized by him and others, and we know famously, of course, Mark Twain as well, backwater of a crumbling Ottoman Empire, malaria infested, underdeveloped. The entire Jewish population at that point was approximately 55,000 people. And you think about it, I live, Baruch Hashem, in Malay Adumim, where B'li Ayin Hara, we have over 42,000 people. And with the next few years, the next 10 years, expectations to double that population, Bezrat Hashem, between the new neighborhood and all the new building, Ken Yerbu, 55,000. We're 42,000. So Ken Yerbu. So it's a very small population in the country. The old Yishuv, as we've talked about before, pre-Zionist communities were mostly, at that point, were still already comprised mostly of religious Jews in the holy cities, Yerushalayim, Hebron, Tzfat, Tiberia, and they were sustained by the subject that we dealt with before called the Chalukah. The Chalukah meant literally distribution, but it meant donations from the diaspora. They studied Torah, they prayed for redemption, but they were not the people who were building the country. And that's not a complaint, it's just a statement. But Ben Gurion came with different intentions. He is part of that second wave of Aliyah. The primarily socialist, secular Jewish immigrant who come during those 10 years of 1904 to 1914. And they're fleeing pogroms, they're fleeing persecution, and they're also being inspired by revolutionary ideals. There are revolutions already going on in the world. There are already things, the Russian Revolution and the others are, there's bubbling, and there's when we talked about in the 1700s, the 18th century, we talked about the American Revolution, French Revolution, the Jewish Revolution of the birth of Hasidut. Things happen in waves in history, not just Jewish history, but in history in general. So too now, the concept of revolution. Think Lahavdil, the Arab Spring. Think about what's happened in this last couple of years. If you want to see Yad Hashem, the change in Hezbollah in Lebanon is not the same as it was. Gaza is not the same as it was. Iran is about to be not the same as it was. Syria is not the way as it was. Every single one of these things is this whole ring that's been around, the ring of fire around Israel, has radically changed in the last 2 years. And if there's anything to be seen positive that came out of the horrific massacre of October 7th, it's this, is where we're going next. Bezrat Hashem. So these people, these pioneers come starting in 1904 approximately. Many of them are teenagers, young adults. They cannot wait for divine redemption. They decide that they're going to come to Israel because they want to rebuild and create a country through physical labor. They spoke of what was called the conquest by labor or conquest of labor. The idea the Jews had to transform themselves, which is a subject we talked about before, about Mohilever, for example, who established an agricultural college so people would learn how to work the land. Some of these people are ones who are coming from there, and that they have to transform the country and people from being a people of merchants, peddlers, and such, to scholars and people who work the land, people who are not just sitting and learning, not people who are not just making shoes, people who are not just selling shmatas, but who are also going to be building the land with their literally with their own two hands. They approached many of these people who came, who were the secular people, not all, but a lot of them were secular at this point, come with almost a religious fervor. And even though they rejected religious observance, they were still coming to this idea of rebuilding the land of Israel. I say rebuilding because it's always been ours, just temporarily been loaned out for a couple thousand years to rebuild the land as a homeland for the Jewish people. David Ben Gurion throws himself into agricultural work, and what does he decide to do? He's not yet a somebody. He's still a relative nobody, but in his mind, he feels the harder the work, the more he is contributing to the cause. He goes to work, which is kind of funny. I was just telling somebody the other day about Petach Tikva. Go back at that time period, and even quite a bit later than that. Petach Tikva was filled with orange groves, and I remember years ago, Petach Tikva for Shabbat, and we were hosted by some friends, and we're walking to shul, and he stopped walking through the street to the shul, and he stopped me for. He says, "Just look around you." I said, "Okay." He says, "Okay, all this 50 years ago is just orange groves." So, and all the changes, of course, that have happened since then. But he threw himself into his work in the orange groves of Petach Tikva. Later, I'm working in the fields in the Galil, and literally chose whatever was considered the hardest physical job, physical labor he could do. Because to him, it wasn't just an economic activity. This was a form of a national birth. Now, I'm putting words in his mouth right now. He did not say this. This is how I picture it. We know that when Chava is given a punishment for eating from the Eitz Hadat, from the tree of knowledge, it says the Etzed Tel Dibanim, just quoted this the other night in Mishlei, that she will have pain in childbirth. He sees the birth of Israel as a birth of a new country. And pain is involved, not just in national pain of what they've gone through to here, but he needs to put his blood, sweat, and tears into this, just like Adam HaRishon is given the punishment of that he has to, by the sweat of his brow, that so these are his, again, I'm intuiting this. He didn't say this. He was remaking himself. At this point, he's already remaking himself. And through that, he's hoping to influence not his family, not his friends, but he had these grand ideas of hopefully influencing all the Jewish people. Because he felt that the people of the book would become the people of the plow. That they would not just be the people who would know the Torah and Tanakh and the Talmud, but they would also know how to work the land. His early living conditions were horrific. Extreme poverty, hardship, malaria. He wasn't the only one to suffer from this, but these are in his biography. I read a biography of him last year, one of those real thick ones. It was absolutely fascinating. I learned so much about him that I did not know. He suffered from malaria, as I said. That happened because of all the marshlands and all the wet standing water, with the mosquitoes, and it just was rampant. And unfortunately, many people would die. Many of the pioneers, the early Chalutzim to Israel, died because of it. Some actually, in the first Aliyah, which we talked about, returned to Russia because they couldn't take the difficulties. He also went hungry. He went hungry because he slept outside. Sometimes he even slept outside, had no food. He slept in workers' barracks. But he saw the suffering as something positive. He saw a gain, a benefit, that he was doing something physically. Again, I do like sometimes how some of my different classes intersect. I don't want to say intersectionality because that's a dirty word today, but they intersect with concepts. And the concept that we're talking about of suffering and that good can come out of it was the topic on Sunday night in Mishlei. he felt it was almost a form of asceticism. Now, that is not a goal to strive for in religious Jewish life. Matter of fact, the Mesilat Yesharim, the Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Lutzato, makes it very clear in the beginning of the Mesilat Yesharim, Path of the Just, that one is not to live a life of asceticism, of abstaining from food and sleep, and putting himself or herself in a terrible situation just to suffer. That's not who we are. He thinks, because he says in the beginning, he says that's how some people think. That's how you become a tzaddik. It's not how you become a tzaddik. Maybe one or two people can do that, but the average person you cannot. But he did see this for himself. Don't trust me. I'm almost sure he never would have read Mesilat Yesharim. It's possible, but probably didn't. But he saw this as a form of asceticism in order to help him personally grow into this position. It was a secular version of religious self-denial, in a sense. And that characterized Jewish life in exile because he felt he was a microcosm of what he left behind in Europe. He left behind in Poland/Russia, that people were starving, people were sick, people were dying. He's doing the same thing, but now there's a goal, there's a benefit to what he's doing. His labor Zionism celebrated the body, meaning he felt it was part of the whole redemption process, the national redemption process, and he put it into practice directly by himself. He becomes increasingly involved in the labor movement, and he is again helps one of the other founders a little bit later of the Poalei Tzion and Workers of Zion movement, combining Zionism and Marxist socialism. And I told you before I would explain to you what that meant. I'm going to read to you one paragraph. What is Marxist socialism? And I didn't make this up. I looked it up because I can tell you like in one sentence on the top of my head, this is a better example. It's a transitional system where the working class seizes control of the state and means of production from the bourgeoisie, abolishing private ownership to establish collective control, prioritize human needs over profit, and move toward a stateless, classless, communist society, distributing resources based on contribution during this initial phase. In other words, New York City, in the eyes of Mamdani. It's each according to his need, each according to his abilities. That's the line from communism early on when we talk about Stalin and others, which we will, I guess, eventually. That was not what the basis was of his beliefs, though. He was influenced by it because he didn't believe in a lot of the Marxist perspective, but the socialist subcategory of that he did believe in. And the synthesis was really a bit of a controversy on both sides. Many socialists saw nationalism as a distraction from class struggle. We have to bond together. And Zionists saw socialism as a dangerous foreign ideology. So Jews are never satisfied. We know that. You can't satisfy. That's like, probably the worst job I can think of, or business, if I ever open one, would be to be an owner of a restaurant. I'm sure they're wonderful people and have to have a lot of patience and live on slim margins, but whatever it might be, it's hard to please Jewish people. Okay, unfortunately, there are people who just love to complain. There are also a good percentage of people who like to say good things too, which is nice. But you're talking about, you can't look at this time of history, which isn't that long ago, through your eyes of 2026, Tafshin Pei-Vav. You can't. It doesn't work. You have to think back. You're talking now looking as if you just transport yourself for a minute in your mind back to the shtetl and back to after the shtetl and the time of the Haskalah movement, which we talked about, and looking forward, like these are really big gains that are happening. People are making some big decisions and having some of these deep thoughts that are going to mold what will become eventually the land of Israel. In 1910, Ben Gurion published an article under his new Hebrew name, which is the name was again Green or Grun in before he came to this point. And he changes his name to David Ben Gurion. Now, there are many people, I'm sure some people will be listening tonight or other time after tonight, whose name you changed, your family name was changed to Hebraicize it at some point. Sometimes, depending on your family history, it may have been to make it more American, more secular. One of the greatest ones I've heard, I've told this before, is from Aish, Rabbi Daniel Mechanic, who's a brilliant, brilliant individual who, if you ever have someone say to you, how do we know we're right about Judaism? And how do we know? How do we know? How do we know? Listen to any of his stuff. He's incredible. Anyways, so his name is Rabbi Daniel Mechanic. He explains in his talks, I've heard him say it many times, I think it was his grandfather. When he came over through Ellis Island, the guy who was processing him asked him what his profession was. What his name was. So he thought he was asking him what his profession was. He says, I'm a mechanech, I'm a teacher. So the guy wrote down mechanic. That's how it became Daniel Mechanic. That's how the name became. It's not because they were worked on cars, none of that stuff. Anyways, so sometimes when a person does choose a name, when a person chooses a name, to Hebraicize a name, it's either to make it equivalent to the English name, and sometimes it's to make a statement. There's a Gemara that tells us about a man whose name was Shimon bar Giora. Shimon bar Giora was involved in the Mered, the revolt in the first century against the Romans. He was involved with the Bar Kokhba revolt, leading up to it especially. He was a warrior. He stood up for what was right. He stood up in spite of the fact that he could die. He stood up against those who were tormenting the Jews. And David Ben Gurion saw that as a name to take on because he felt he needed that. It was similar to Gurion. Instead of taking Giora, he takes Gurion. A gur, Gimel Vav Resh, is a cub, like a lion cub. Not losers like Chicago Cubs, unfortunately. Whatever. I'm a Cubs fan. But at least the Bears are going all the way this year. What can I say? Yeah, you're shaking your head there. Yeah. What can I say? I say that's the true meaning of what Emunah is. Being a Chicago Cubs fan, that's Emunah. Anyone can believe in God, but to believe in the Chicago Cubs, you really have to have Emunah. Anyways, so the choice of his name of Ben Gurion is very significant because he's consciously placing himself in traditional Jewish resistance. It wasn't just about resistance, it's about sovereignty. Remember, it was, even though he's breaking away from the Jewish religious mold or practice, he understood that by choosing that name, and again, it wasn't just that's a merit, it's just a revolt against the Bar Kokhba time against the Romans, it's the last gasp. It wasn't just about that. It was about going against the tormentors and looking for sovereignty, to take the land back, to have it be under the Jews' hand. And that's why he chose this name. Throughout his life, Ben Gurion will keep this complex relationship with Jewish tradition. Again, he knew Tanakh intimately. He could quote it extensively, as could almost every cab driver in Israel. I don't know if you know, but in Israel, it's mandated that in every school, even the secular schools that do Bagriot, there's a Bagrut in Tanakh. Everyone has to learn Tanakh. Doesn't mean the whole Tanakh, but there are certain sections that have to be learned. In any case, so he knew Tanakh, he was able to quote it, and the Zionist movement in his mind became a direct continuation on one hand of the biblical narrative, and he actually said that he felt that the pioneers, the Chalutzim, the early builders of the land of Israel, were spiritual descendants of the people like from the time of Yehoshua, and the people at the time of the Shoftim, the early building of the land of Israel. He had little patience for halacha and even less for the Orthodox establishment. I'll leave it like that for now, because we're going to talk about his relationship with the Orthodox establishment at a different time. Okay, programming note. Bezrat Hashem,